Caleb Reed spent 11 years carefully building every wire, every line of code, every silent safeguard holding Nexus Technologies together. No manual, no documentation. Just one quiet man and a system that had never once failed. Then Giselle Hartman arrived with a briefcase and a far better idea. She stood before the entire engineering floor and explained, without apology, that one person was no longer sufficient. 30 specialists would replace him. Modern, scalable. He carried his box out without a word. Nobody expected him to smile. Nobody expected him to return. But systems always collapse when the architect walks away. What happens when the one man everyone underestimated holds the only key to saving everything? Keep watching to find out. The 7th floor of the Nexus Technologies building was quiet at 11:47 in the evening. Every desk sat empty, every overhead light had been dimmed to its lowest setting, and the only sounds in the room were the low hum of server fans from the far end of the hall and the steady, unhurried rhythm of a single keyboard. Caleb Reed had been sitting at that desk for the past 4 hours, his face lit by the pale blue glow of 4 monitors arranged in a careful arc in front of him. On the corner of the desk sat a mug of coffee that had gone cold sometime around 9 o'clock, and beside it, propped against the base of the nearest monitor, a small framed photograph of a 9-year-old girl holding a thick book with both hands and smiling at whoever had taken the picture. Caleb was 38 years old, though most people who met him in a professional context guessed older, because there was a stillness about him that did not match the age. His hair had started going gray at the temples in the past 2 years, and he wore the same kind of flannel shirt he had been wearing since his first week at the company, and the soles of his work shoes had been worn smooth on the outside edge from years of the same commute, the same hallways, the same chair. He was not the kind of man who drew attention to himself in meetings or who had a practiced elevator pitch for what he did. When someone from a new department asked him to describe his role, he usually thought for a moment and said something like, "I keep the lights on." It was, by any precise measure, the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about his job. What Caleb Reed actually did was something far more significant than the phrase suggested. He was the sole architect of every infrastructure layer that held Nexus Technologies together. The processing pipelines, the failover systems, the security protocols, the encryption frameworks, the entire invisible skeleton that allowed 2,300,000 enterprise accounts to execute transactions, move capital, and sign contracts every single day without interruption. There was no formal documentation for any of it. No diagram existed in any company folder, no manual sat in any shared drive, no step-by-step breakdown had ever been filed in any onboarding directory. Every decision made over 11 years, every shortcut avoided, every crisis quietly resolved at 2 in the morning while the rest of the building slept, every architectural choice that had preserved data integrity through power failures and server replacements and the gradual scaling of the client base from hundreds to hundreds of thousands. All of it lived in the mind of one man in a flannel shirt who drank cold coffee and never once asked to be celebrated for any of it. 11 years ago, Caleb had been the 3rd person hired at Nexus when the company was a 12-person operation working out of a rented floor above a print shop on the east side of the city. The CEO at that time was a man named Marcus Webb, and Marcus had 2 qualities that set him apart from most people Caleb would ever work for. He understood the boundaries of his own knowledge, and he trusted the people whose knowledge extended beyond his. Marcus gave Caleb a server room, a reasonable budget, and no interference, and what Caleb built over the decade that followed was something that never made headlines and never failed either. During the internal financial shock of 2019, when a cascade of client payment defaults nearly collapsed the company, and the board was meeting in emergency sessions 3 nights a week, it was the infrastructure that held, silently, without drama, exactly as it had been designed to do. The email from Human Resources arrived at 6:42 in the morning, while Caleb was still at his desk. The subject line read, "Mandatory all-hands meeting, engineering floor, 9 a.m." He read it once, closed his laptop slowly, and finished the last cold swallow at the bottom of his mug. He did not read it a second time. 3 weeks before that morning, the board of directors at Nexus Technologies had voted 7-2 to bring Giselle Hartman in as the new chief executive officer. The 2 dissenting votes came from Diana Voss, a board member who had been with the company since its 3rd year, and one other director whose name was not publicly disclosed. Diana had not objected to Giselle as a person, she had objected to the pace. Too much change compressed into too little time in a company whose most critical systems had no documented blueprint. That concern was entered into the meeting minutes and then set aside without further discussion. Giselle Hartman was 42 years old and moved through a room the way someone moves when they have spent a long time being told they are exceptional and have quietly decided to believe it. Her hair was dark and cut short and precise, and she dressed in gray or navy suits, and she had a professional record that was genuinely impressive. 3 technology companies restructured, 2 turned from near bankruptcy to profitability within 4 years. 1 sold for a figure that made the board members who had voted for her feel very satisfied with themselves. She did not ask many questions, because she had found that asking questions slowed things down, and she had built her career on moving faster than other people were comfortable with. In her first 2 weeks at Nexus, Giselle conducted what she called a structural audit. She sat in on meetings without speaking, walked floors without explaining herself, and read reports that had not been prepared specifically for her. Then she sent the board a document titled Dependency Risk Assessment, Nexus Infrastructure, and in that document she described Caleb Reed using the phrase single point of failure. Not his name, not his history with the company, not the 11 years of work that had quietly kept every system running, just the category, a structural flaw to be corrected. Her solution was a team of 30 specialized engineers contracted through a consulting firm called Architect Solutions. Cloud architects, DevOps engineers, database specialists, security professionals. The total cost of that contract was 8 times Caleb's annual compensation, but that figure did not appear on the first page of her proposal to the board. What appeared on the first page were words like scalability, redundancy, future-proofing, and institutional resilience. The board approved it within 48 hours. Owen Blake had heard the news from a contact in human resources 3 days before the all-hands meeting. Owen was a mid-level engineer who had shared a floor with Caleb for 6 of those 11 years, and he found him in the break room that afternoon and told him everything he knew without editing it. Caleb listened without interrupting. He did not go pale. He did not raise his voice. He did not ask how certain the information was or whether there was any avenue of appeal. He nodded slowly and said, "Thanks for telling me." Then he finished the second half of his sandwich. Owen stood there for a moment, watching, trying to read the stillness on his face, and could not find an interpretation that satisfied him. The all-hands meeting began at exactly 9 in the morning with 47 people seated in the large conference room on the engineering floor. Giselle stood at the head of the table with Aaron Mitchell to her left, and a woman from Human Resources whom Caleb had never met before to her right. There was no screen, no slide deck, no visual presentation of any kind. Giselle had always found that slides made people feel like they were watching a performance rather than being told something true, and she preferred the latter. She opened with language about the future, about scale and ambition, about the demands that regional expansion would place on infrastructure systems, about the distance between where the company's technology currently stood and where it needed to be. She was measured and professional and clear, and for the first 5 minutes of the speech she did not mention Caleb Reed by name. Everyone in the room understood what was coming. No one spoke. Then she turned and looked directly at him. He was seated in the 3rd row of chairs along the left wall, and she addressed him in front of 46 colleagues because this was, in her words, a matter of organizational strategy rather than anything personal, and presenting such decisions openly reduced speculation and helped teams move forward without lingering ambiguity. She had the generosity, or the calculation, to frame what she was saying as something not entirely fair to him, that it was not equitable to any organization or to any individual to build a structure in which a single person carried knowledge that no one else could access. She said that Nexus had relied for too long on an architecture that could not survive the departure of one employee. She said a company of this scale had a responsibility to its clients that superseded any individual contribution, however significant. She said what she was announcing was not a reflection of his performance but of the company's need to build something more durable, and she used the word durable 4 times. The room was very quiet. Owen Blake's hand tightened on the edge of his chair. Several younger engineers found reasons to look at their phones. A woman named Jessica, who had joined the team 8 months earlier and barely knew Caleb, looked at him with an expression she could not fully name. Caleb did not interrupt. He did not frown or cross his arms or show any of the physical signals of a person deciding whether to fight. He sat with both hands resting flat on his knees and let her finish. He had spent 11 years in rooms where decisions were made without him and had learned over a long time that argument in the wrong moment costs more than silence in the right one. What Giselle saw on his face, she would think about later, was not defeat and was not indifference, but she did not have a name for what it actually was. When she paused and asked, without particular warmth, whether he had anything he wanted to say, he stood up. He looked around the room once, not scanning for sympathy, not making a statement, just looking, the way a person looks at a place they are leaving, and said, "No, thank you for the time." Then he walked out. He collected his things in under 5 minutes. The framed photograph, a worn composition notebook he had carried since his second year at the company, a pair of over-ear headphones. He placed them into a black canvas bag, not a cardboard box, nothing theatrical, and did it neatly and without ceremony, the way a man packs for a trip he has been quietly preparing for. Owen followed him into the hallway, his voice carrying a slight tremor when he asked if Caleb was all right. Caleb looked at him and smiled, briefly, a small private smile that Owen could not interpret, and said, "Do good work." Then he walked to the elevator. When the doors were about to close, he glanced back down the hall and saw Giselle standing at the far end watching him leave. The distance between them was perhaps 40 feet. They held each other's gaze for exactly 1 second, and then the elevator doors shut between them. What Giselle had not considered, what she had not thought to consider, because it only matters after it becomes a problem, was what Caleb had not left behind. He had not sabotaged anything. He had not altered a single access credential, not changed a password, not planted anything that would cause harm. He was not that kind of man, and he had no interest in destruction or in the kind of small revenge that shrinks the person who commits it. But he had also not left a roadmap. He had not created a transition document, recorded a system walkthrough, or drafted any knowledge transfer material of any kind. He had not done so because no one had asked him to, and because, more simply, such a document had never existed. No map had ever been made, because no map had ever been needed. Everything that ran the company's infrastructure ran because Caleb Reed understood it, and Caleb Reed was gone. 2 weeks after the meeting, the 7th floor looked nothing like itself. 30 engineers from Architect Solutions had arrived with new laptops, standing desks, noise-canceling headphones, and a digital project board mounted on the wall near the server room. The floor was louder and more energetic and considerably more well-staffed than it had ever been, and Jackson Cole, the team lead architect had assigned to the engagement, moved through the space with the confidence of a man who had been hired to solve a specific problem and fully expected to solve it on schedule. Jackson was 32 years old, had earned degrees from institutions the board found reassuring, and had worked at 2 companies that had each been valued above $1 billion. He spoke quickly and presented ideas in terms that suggested everything was already under control, and Giselle had liked him from their first meeting and had continued to like him, and that approval functioned in practice as permission for Jackson to move forward without asking too many questions. The first sign of trouble was not dramatic. It arrived as a timeline that missed its target. The architect team had estimated 2 weeks to fully map the existing system architecture before beginning their transition work. 6 weeks later, they were still mapping. The infrastructure Caleb had built did not follow the frameworks that 30 experienced engineers had spent their careers working within. It did not use the standard patterns they recognized, did not organize its components the way any published methodology suggested, and did not make its internal logic visible to people who had not been present for the decisions that created it. Everything was running, every transaction queue, every client-facing process, every failover mechanism, but it was running in a way that was fundamentally opaque to anyone who had not built it. Jackson sent an email to Caleb's personal address requesting a technical consultation. 3 days later, Caleb replied in a single sentence, "I am no longer employed at Nexus. Any questions about company systems should be directed through the legal department." It was polite, correct, and entirely unhelpful. Somewhere in the lower architecture of the Nexus system, there was a module Caleb had named Anchor. It was not referenced in any document because no documents existed, and when the architect team encountered it during the mapping process, they noted it as apparent legacy redundancy, a leftover component from an older build that had not yet been cleaned up. They entered it on the project board under a category labeled Migrate after core stabilization and moved on to other priorities. The board showed green in every column. Jackson filed his weekly report, and Giselle read it without concern. No one in the room knew that the note they had written about Anchor would, within 6 months, cost the company more than the entire architect contract was worth. 3 days after leaving Nexus, Caleb received a brief email from Marcus Webb. "Heard what happened. Call when you're ready." He read it, folded the laptop screen down, and made coffee. In the first week after leaving, he repaired a workbench in his spare room that had been broken since the previous winter, cooked actual meals instead of ordering takeout, and slept before 11 o'clock at night for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember. There was a silence in the apartment during those first few days that he had to learn to be inside again. Not the silence of a man with nothing to do, but the silence of a man who had been moving at an unsustainable speed and had finally, without choosing it, been given permission to stop. After the first week, he opened a file on his personal laptop that he had not touched in 3 years. It was not a Nexus file. It was a design document for a system architecture he had been thinking about for a long time and had never had the hours to actually build, and working on it in the mornings felt different from anything he had done inside an office. It felt like something that belonged entirely to him. Within 3 weeks, consulting inquiries had arrived from 3 different organizations: a regional logistics company, a mid-sized private bank, and a fintech startup in its Series B round that was struggling with transaction layer reliability. He replied to all 3 and accepted the fintech engagement on a part-time consulting basis, naming his hourly rate without hesitation. On a Saturday morning roughly 6 weeks after leaving Nexus, he took his daughter Emma to the public library 2 blocks from their building, and she came out of the young adult section carrying 3 books stacked with the focused efficiency of someone who had already decided exactly what she wanted. He watched her at the checkout counter and thought, simply, without embellishment, that it was the first Saturday in longer than he could account for, that he had been somewhere with her and not been running a background calculation about something waiting for him when he got home. 4 months after leaving Nexus, a call came in from an unfamiliar number with the area code of the building he had worked in for 11 years. He looked at the screen for a moment, then declined without answering. He did not block it. He was simply not ready to receive it yet. Or rather, the right terms had not yet presented themselves, and he had learned that the right terms always arrived eventually if you were patient enough to let them. 6 months after Caleb Reed walked out of Nexus Technologies, the company prepared to launch what Giselle Hartman had spent the previous 4 months describing, in every available context, as the most significant expansion in the company's history. Nexus Global was designed to serve enterprise clients across Southeast Asia, a market that, by her projections, represented $140 million in contracted value over 2 years. 47 partner organizations had already signed formal agreements. Media coverage had been favorable. 11 days before the scheduled launch date, Giselle had appeared on a prominent technology podcast and spoken about the company's future with the measured certainty of someone who had already decided how the story ends. 3 days before the launch, Jackson Cole called his team together for a late afternoon meeting and presented a problem identified in performance testing. Under peak load simulation, the legacy database layer showed a throughput bottleneck that would, in his estimation, create unacceptable latency in the client-facing dashboard during the opening hours of the Nexus Global rollout. The solution he proposed was a live migration of the core database to the new cloud-native architecture the team had spent 5 months building. He acknowledged the timing was aggressive, but the migration script had been tested in a staging environment and had performed correctly, and executing it overnight, when traffic on the live system was at its lowest point, represented the best available window before the launch. No one in the room pushed back with enough force to change the outcome. The staging tests had looked clean, the logic was defensible, and Jackson had the kind of authority that accumulates when a record of success compounds over time. The migration was scheduled for 2 in the morning. What Jackson did not know about the Anchor module was that it was not legacy redundancy. Caleb had built it in the months following the crisis of 2019, after a partial failover event had revealed a specific class of data corruption risk during live system transitions. Anchor was a transaction integrity protection layer, a mechanism that monitored every write operation during any migration or failover event and locked the system into a full frozen state if it detected any pattern attempting to modify core transaction records in a way it had not been designed to recognize. It was not a bug. It was not an artifact of old code that had outlived its purpose. It was one of the most carefully designed components in the entire infrastructure, built specifically to prevent the kind of catastrophic data loss that an improperly executed migration could cause. At 2:17 in the morning, the migration script reached Anchor. The script did not recognize what it was encountering. It categorized the module as an obsolete redundancy node and attempted to overwrite it as part of the transition sequence, and Anchor responded exactly as it had been built to respond. It detected an unauthorized modification attempt against a protected transaction zone, and it activated its full lockdown protocol. freezing every write operation across the entire system. Within 40 seconds, every transaction queue on the Nexus platform stopped processing. 2,300,000 enterprise accounts went dark simultaneously. The dashboards that clients across 6 time zones checked every morning to manage their financial operations filled with red indicators, and automated alert systems that had never fired in 11 years of the platform's existence triggered all at once in a cascade that the on-call monitoring service escalated to emergency status inside of 3 minutes. Jackson was asleep when the alerts came in. By the time he was on his laptop, 7 of his engineers were already in the system, and within an hour all 30 of them were working. They worked through 3 in the morning and through 4 and through 5 and through 6, and by the time the sun had risen over the city and the launch day had officially and cruelly begun, they had produced nothing but a growing catalog of failed interventions and a shared understanding that they were fighting something they did not fully comprehend. Anchor had not simply locked the system. It had locked it in a way that actively resisted every approach they tried. Every attempt to manually override the freeze triggered a secondary lockdown. The safeguard was functioning precisely as intended, and none of them knew how to tell it to stop without risking the data it was protecting. At 6:30 in the morning, Giselle walked into the main conference room and sat down across from Aaron Mitchell and Jackson Cole and looked at the wall-mounted dashboard, which was entirely red. The emails from partner organizations had already begun arriving. 3 of the largest had sent formal communications citing SLA violation thresholds and demanding a response within 4 hours. Giselle called an external consulting firm she kept for technical emergencies. They arrived within 90 minutes, reviewed the system, and told her what she had not been prepared to hear. The architecture was unlike anything in their experience. The lockdown mechanism was functioning as an intentional safety design rather than an error state, and reversing it without understanding the original logic would risk corrupting every transaction record in the database. Then one of the consultants looked at her directly and asked a question she had been dreading since the previous night. The person who built this system, do you have a way to reach them? The first 24 hours of the crisis produced the particular kind of motion that looks like progress while generating none. Jackson's team rotated in shifts, some engineers sleeping on break room couches and others cycling back in after brief rests, and the system remained locked. Every bypass technique they attempted was absorbed by Anchor's secondary protocols, as though the module had anticipated their approach, which, in a precise sense, it had. Caleb had layered the protection with the understanding that a future team might attempt exactly this kind of intervention, and he had accounted for it. By midday, a post on an anonymous technology forum described a major service outage at Nexus Technologies affecting dozens of partner integrations, and the post attracted attention quickly. By 4 in the afternoon, 2 trade publications had called the company's communications department, and by evening the first article had run under the headline, Nexus Technologies hit by unexplained outage hours before major expansion launch. The stock price closed that day down 12%. Diana Voss called an emergency board session that evening and sat at the head of the table and asked Giselle a single direct question. When would the system be fully restored? Giselle said the team was working on it. Diana asked again, in different words, not when was the team working, but when would it be done? Giselle did not have a specific answer. Diana wrote something on the notepad in front of her and did not speak again for the rest of the session. On the second day, 3 of the largest partner organizations formally invoked their SLA violation clauses, putting $67 million in contracted value at immediate risk, and a regional bank that had been among the company's longest-standing clients issued a public statement temporarily suspending its Nexus integration pending resolution. The stock fell another 14%. Owen Blake had been watching all of it from his desk, going through the motions of his own work while tracking the mounting damage around him. He had thought about saying something for 2 full days before he finally acted on it. The hesitation was not cowardice. It was the reasonable reluctance of a person who is about to step into the space between 2 forces that are much larger than himself. But on the afternoon of the second day, he went to Diana Voss's office. Not through the scheduling system, not through any official channel, and knocked on her open door and stepped inside and said the thing that everyone had been circling around for 48 hours without naming. The only person who can open Anchor is the person who built it. Diana held his gaze steadily, without surprise, as if she had already arrived at this conclusion and had simply been waiting for someone else to say it out loud. Caleb Reed, she said. Owen nodded. Aaron Mitchell had already made 3 attempts to reach Caleb through direct channels. A phone call that went to voicemail, an email that received no response, and a personal message sent through a former HR staff member who had maintained a friendly relationship with Caleb during his time at the company. None of them heard back. The silence was not hostile. It was the silence of a man who had been told his terms were not required, and who had restructured his life accordingly, and who was not about to dismantle that structure on someone else's timeline. On the 3rd day, the stock price dropped another 16%, bringing the cumulative 3-day loss to over 30% of the company's market value. A financial publication ran a feature piece examining Nexus's recent restructuring, and though the article was careful with its language, its conclusion was not difficult to read. Jackson Cole sent an email to Giselle at 7:40 in the evening, after 70 hours of near-continuous work. The email was 4 sentences long. The engineering team had exhausted every available technical approach. Anchor could not be safely reversed without access to the original design logic. The migration could not be completed without understanding what Anchor was built to protect against. The final sentence read, "We need Caleb Reed. There is no other option." Giselle sat in her office after reading it. The city outside the window had gone dark. She knew what she had to do, and she made herself sit with the weight of it for a moment before reaching for her phone. It was not Giselle who made contact first. Diana Voss called Caleb's personal number at 8:45 in the evening on the 3rd day, without consulting anyone. The board had rights and responsibilities in a crisis of this magnitude that did not require the CEO's prior approval, and Diana had decided to exercise them. Caleb was at his kitchen table when the phone rang, and he looked at the name on the screen, Diana Voss, Board of Directors, and answered on the 2nd ring. Diana did not open with an apology. She did not offer context or attempt to soften what she was saying. She said, "The system is locked. The engineering team has been working on it for 72 hours and cannot find a path forward. I am calling you because this is a genuine emergency, and I believe you understand exactly what that means." There was silence on the line for 3 seconds. Caleb said, "I understand." She asked if he would be willing to come in. He said he would need time to think about his terms and would call her back within 2 hours. He called back in 91 minutes. His terms were as follows: $800 per hour, a minimum engagement of 40 hours, with 50% of the total paid in advance before he entered the building. The engagement would cover infrastructure recovery only. He would restore the system to full operational status, and when that work was complete, he would leave. He was not available for ongoing employment, advisory arrangements, or any continued relationship with Nexus Technologies. Those were his terms stated once, not subject to negotiation. Diana said she would bring them to the board immediately. She called back 37 minutes later and said the board had agreed to every condition without revision and that the wire transfer would be initiated first thing in the morning. Caleb said, "Good. I'll be there at 7. After the call ended, he sat at the table for a moment, then opened his laptop and returned to the architecture document he had been working on before the phone rang. He had been in the middle of a particularly involved section, a load distribution logic problem he had been thinking through for several days, and he wanted to finish the paragraph before the thread of thought left him. He worked for another 40 minutes, closed the document, made tea, and went to bed at his usual hour. At 7 in the morning, Caleb Reed walked through the main entrance of Nexus Technologies carrying a black canvas bag. One of the security staff at the front desk recognized him and opened the access gate without being asked. No visitor badge, no escort. The man simply opened the gate and Caleb walked through. When the elevator opened on the 7th floor, the room was fully occupied. All 30 Architect engineers at their stations, overhead lights at full brightness. The project board on the wall showing the kind of red-heavy status that accumulates when a team has been fighting the same problem for 3 days without measurable progress. The room went quiet when Caleb stepped off the elevator. Not the polite quiet of a meeting starting, but the different kind that falls over a group of people when someone they have been waiting for has finally arrived. Jackson Cole stood up from his chair reflexively before he was aware he had decided to. Caleb crossed the floor without greeting anyone, pulled out the nearest open chair, sat down, opened his laptop, and looked at Jackson. "Pull up the logs from 2 a.m. on launch night," he said. He worked without explanation for the first hour. He entered command sequences that no one in the room recognized, navigated through the system's architecture with the speed of someone moving through familiar rooms in the dark, and spoke only to ask for a specific file or confirm a timestamp. There was nothing theatrical about it. He was not performing competence for an audience. He was simply working the way he had always worked, methodically, precisely, and without any apparent need for acknowledgement. A junior engineer on the architect team leaned over at one point and asked whether the access sequence Caleb had just used was documented anywhere in the codebase. Caleb answered without looking up from the screen, "No." By the end of the 4th hour, the first sign of movement appeared, the outermost lock in Anchor's protocol released, and a portion of the transaction queue began processing for the first time in more than 80 hours. The room registered this with a visible shift. People sat up straighter, low conversations started, and one corner of the project board changed from red to something more promising. Giselle appeared in the doorway at the end of the 6th hour. She stood there for a while without speaking, watching, and when Caleb finally looked up and saw her, he asked, in the same tone he used for everything, "Do you need something?" "No edge, no performance. Just the question," she said. "You're doing good work." The words seemed to cost her something. Caleb held her gaze for a moment and then turned back to the screen. "I'm doing the work I'm being paid to do," he said. At the end of the 11th hour, the last lock in Anchor's protocol released, and the system returned to full operation. Every transaction queue was running. Every client dashboard turned green. The stream of automated alerts that had been generating continuously for 83 hours went silent all at once, and the sudden absence of that sound was its own kind of announcement. Caleb closed his laptop and stood up. Owen Blake had been there for most of the day, sitting at his own station, watching without interfering, and he crossed the floor and extended his hand without saying anything. Caleb shook it. Before picking up his bag, Caleb turned to Jackson and spoke without accusation or performance. "Anchor is a transaction integrity failsafe. Do not modify it unless you fully understand what it is protecting against. I'll send you a technical summary by email within 3 days." Jackson nodded. He had the look of someone who had just completed a very expensive education. Diana Voss caught Caleb at the elevator and told him the board wanted to extend an offer for a longer-term engagement, on whatever terms he chose to name. Caleb considered this, genuinely, briefly, and then shook his head. "I have my own work now," he said, "but thank you." The elevator opened and he stepped inside. In the weeks that followed, the damage was assessed with the careful language institutions use when they are documenting their own failures. The board's internal review concluded that the decision to terminate the company's lead systems architect without a structured knowledge transfer process, combined with the decision to execute a live database migration on a production system less than 48 hours before a major platform launch, represented two distinct strategic errors whose convergence had been, in retrospect, foreseeable. Giselle Hartman was not removed immediately, but the board appointed an independent chief technology officer whose authority over infrastructure decisions superseded hers, and several of the responsibilities she had held since arriving were redistributed without ceremony. It was the first time in her career that she had not controlled the full outcome of a situation she had set in motion. She sat alone in the conference room one afternoon after a long board session, after everyone else had gathered their folders and left. On the table in front of her was the review report. She turned to the final page and read the closing line slowly. The departure of the lead architect created an undocumented knowledge gap that no standard transition process could have bridged within the available timeframe. She folded the report, set it on the table, and looked out the window at the city below for a long time. The story had no interest in telling her what she was thinking. The expression on her face said enough. 11 days after his final day inside the building, the advance payment and the remaining balance of Caleb's consulting fee were transferred to his account exactly as agreed. He looked at the notification for a moment, set his phone down, and returned to the work he had been doing. An architecture document now well over 100 pages, dense with decisions he had been turning over for years, and finally had both the time and the freedom to execute correctly. The fintech startup had asked whether he was open to expanding the scope of the engagement. He was considering it. A week after the system was restored, Diana Voss sent him a short message. "If you ever want someone from a board perspective involved in what you're building, I'm interested." He read it twice, set the phone down, and thought about it for a full day before writing back. "Let me think about it." It was not a refusal. It was, in fact, the most open response he had offered to any invitation in quite some time, and he did not press himself to understand exactly what that meant. On a Tuesday morning, with the sun coming through the kitchen window and a cup of coffee still warm on the desk beside him, Caleb Reed opened a new file on his personal laptop. He looked at the name he had typed in the title field for a moment, The way a person looks at the first line of something that belongs entirely to them and has not yet been complicated by anyone else's opinion of it. Then he began to work, not for a company that had decided he was expendable, not to prove anything to a room that had watched him leave without a word of argument, not because he needed the world to acknowledge what it had cost itself by underestimating him. He worked simply because this was the work and the work was his, and it had always, from the very beginning, been enough. The file was named Anchor 2.0.